Hello. Grace, can you hear me? Okay. Oh, guys, you know what? You've been muted. But I did see your mouth move in a way that suggested yes. So I'm glad to hear that. And everybody else, I see Francisco. Hello, Roz. Welcome. Laura Dice. Hello, Laura. Mary McLeod. Is that you, Ren? Ren, I'm borrowing your tea maker, by the way. Hope you don't mind. And Sheila. Hello, everyone. Hello. There's Joel. Trusty Joel. Okay. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Let's start with a prayer. In the name of the
Can I make just a quick announcement, Father Mike, before you get started?
Please
Sorry.
do.
So just to let everybody know, we're going to keep everybody on mute and we're going to hold questions until the end. So that's why you can't unmute yourselves right now. So you can chat. If you're watching on the live stream, you can chat on the live stream as well if you have any questions there. And we'll hold questions till the end. If you can raise your hand within Zoom, that would be great. And then we will unmute folks as questions come in.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily.
Yep.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Sorry for the delay too. We had to do a little technical workaround to an issue we were facing, and that just was sort of time consuming. But let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Direct, O Lord, our actions by thy holy inspiration, and carry them on by the gracious assistance, that every word and work of ours may begin in thee, and by thee be happily ended. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. I hope this talk goes well, frankly. I'm not used to I'm still getting used to the Zoom format. It's still a little challenging. And I chose this topic with the Zoom format in mind because it's easy to display something on Zoom, and it's easy to talk about images. And in fact, I'm going to talk about an image that comes up that I try to bring up in my homilies, but which is hard to do because, of course, in a homily, I don't have a visual display, so that I have to explain everything. I actually confronted this the other day during the Feast of St. Matthew, because on the Feast of St. Matthew, I always talk about Caravaggio. Caravaggio is this Italian master painter. He depicted the call of Matthew, and so I'm forced to describe it for the congregation, but here I can just sort of show you what I'm talking about. And this image of Van Gogh's Sower, if I'm not talking about it actively, whenever this gospel passage comes up, namely the parable of the sower, it's at least in the back of my mind. So I thought, well, okay, let's talk about this. I hope it's of interest. My confidence that it would be of interest was diminished a couple of weeks ago when somebody kind of came upon me when I was down in my garden, kind of gathering things up there. And he said, oh, hey, Father Mike, I see you're giving another talk. And I said, yeah, I was thinking about doing it on Vincent van Gogh. And his face kind of fell. I think he was hoping for another Crusader story. He was looking for war stories, and which is great. Maybe someday I'll get back to that. But for now, it's going to be Van Gogh, simply because of the visual element. It's going to help a lot. So here we are. I thought I would introduce Van Gogh a little bit. Not going to spend, his biography is less important than his images for the time being, but it is relevant, and a few details are going to be helpful. Vincent van Gogh, that's exactly what I was trying to get rid of earlier. Okay, so Vincent van Gogh was born in Zundert in the Netherlands, and he died only 37 years later in southern France, Auvergne, France. And he was born to a kind of a fairly, like a solidly middle-class family. It was a family of preachers. They were Lutheran, and their Lutheran faith was very important to them. In fact, Vincent had tried to become a pastor. His brother, Theo, who was a very important relationship in his life, his friendship with his brother, Theo, who is depicted here. For a long time, this picture was actually thought to be Vincent himself. It was thought to be a self-portrait, but this is actually Vincent's portrait of his brother, Theo. You can see there was a strong family resemblance. Theo was also a Lutheran pastor. And so they were, they had kind of worked together. Theo became he attempted to become like an art producer, kind of an art entrepreneur. And Vincent rather supported him in that in the early years. And then Vincent was such an avid and such a good drawer that Theo actually Theo was the one who suggested that he become an artist. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But a lot of Vincent's early work is sort of set in, Northern Europe, which has a reputation for at least some portion of the year as being kind of gloomy and cold. And basically Vincent's paintings kind of reflect that. He's attracted to, as you'll see in a moment, as you see even here, he's attracted to peasant life and just the work that humble people do. Some of that is actually a function of the particular kind of Christianity that Vincent and his family was enthusiastic for, that they were very concerned for the poor. And in fact, part of his brother's work as a pastor was to create a relief service for poor people. So there was a real social justice component to the family's brand of Protestantism. So here again, there's another early painting of Vincent's called Sheaves of Wheat. Here's a kind of a well looked at. It's a famous painting of his from his early period anyway, not nearly as famous as his later work, but this one's called The Potato Eaters. Again, humble family, obviously poor, and Vincent was eager to sympathize and kind of connect with simple, poor people, and to kind of sympathize with their struggles and to depict them in a frank and realistic way. There's another portrait of his from his early years. Again, very dark, very heavy. Another painting of his. There's the Potato Eaters again. This is called The Cottage. Same idea. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the Sower, which is this painting. And even in his early years, Vincent was concerned with it. He was taken with this image. In fact, in the course of his career, Vincent depicted images of the Sower, like versions of the Sower, more than 30 times, whether it was in painting or in drawing. In fact, here's an early version from his earliest periods. You can see right off the bat, kind of where Vincent is going with this. We see already this early work forms a great contrast from the works that have made him so famous. And here's one, it's called Starry Night. And it's obviously an image that everybody's very familiar with. And he painted this. This is called Saint-Rémy. This is the town in France where he painted it. He actually painted this from the room of his asylum. Vincent's, one of the features of his biography that's well known is Vincent's struggle with mental illness. And maybe unfortunately, it's the feature of his life that's best known. I think in many cases, as I'll talk about in a moment, it's the only thing that's known about him. And again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. But, when Theo, Vincent's brother, suggested to Vincent that he become an artist, he was fairly late in life. He was 30 years old already. It was kind of too late to go to art school. And so Vincent became self-taught. He consulted books on painting. He sort of studied how to do it. Strangely enough, one of the books that he consulted advocated drawing as the basis for painting. That all painting, the book explained, was founded on the practice of drawing. As it turns out, by the time of Vincent van Gogh's career, that idea was already kind of old-fashioned. It was already out of date, but Vincent didn't know it. But Vincent adopted the method of drawing out meticulously every canvas he would paint. And so, and actually there's a little bit of a personal dimension to this as well, because my first intimate exposure with the work of Vincent van Gogh was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Years ago, before my nieces and nephews showed up, whenever I went home, we would travel down to New York to do something interesting. And it typically involved going to one museum or another. And we went to the Met kind of quite by chance. And again, by chance, it was this exhibit of Vincent van Gogh's work, except it was the drawings. was just it wasn't the finished works. The Met has some of those. In fact, I think the Met might have Starry Night. It might be on permanent display there. But it displayed all of the drawings that Vincent composed in preparation for painting these images. And the reason why I emphasize this is because very often, Vincent van Gogh's technique is thought to have been to just sort of wildly paint, to kind of tap into this feverish inspiration and then throw it on the canvas. And it's just not the case. You can see that he actually planned these quite extensively. This is the drawn version of Starry Night. You can see he drew it all out. I mean, every last bit of it, practically everything except the color, of course, is drawn. This is his famous Cafe Terrace at Night, which he painted in Arles. And here again, completely composed, carefully thought out and drawn out. This is another famous portrait. This is a friend of his in Arles. He was a postman. And there again, there's the drawing. And this is a doctor who treated him when he was in the hospital after his ear was separated from the rest of him. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this was the doctor who treated him for that. And that's not quite the same image drawn out, but it's close. And so, but you can see, you sort of get the idea. Let's see. I should note, as we look at these images, we see that these are people who Vincent knew, who were close to him. These were the people that Vincent depicted in no small part because these were the only people that he could gain access to. Vincent, all his life, just struggled to connect with other people. There was a deep goodness, a deep confidence within him in the goodness of the world. And reading about him, he's a very sympathetic character, but by all accounts, he was extremely difficult to get along with. And he was strange in his mannerisms. He's kind of an extremely introspective guy. And again, it generated what we can frankly call a kind of a weirdness. He was a strange man. And people like doctors or these particular friends who just displayed a kind of a heroic sympathy or a heroic charity for Vincent were the only ones that he could get to sit for his portraits. Vincent wanted to be a portrait painter. His most famous portraits are his self-portraits. In fact, there's one right here. These were almost the only portraits he could paint simply because he was the only one. He was one of the few people who could stand to be in his own presence. He was just kind of a scary guy, or at least he made people feel uncomfortable, and that'll come up again. So let's see. Usually when I have to pause to recollect myself in a talk like this, I ask for questions. It's a little stalling tactic. But because Emily has muted you all, I can't rely on that. So you may have to sort of be patient with me as I awkwardly flip through my notes. But you can see, I should note here, I haven't explained this slide quite yet. As I say, he was born in 1853. In 1887, he traveled to Paris. Paris was the center of European art and really all of European culture at the time. He meets all those famous impressionists, all the ones that you've heard of and whose paintings have become famous, from calendars and placemats and coffee mugs and all the rest of it. Their paintings just seem to be everywhere. But this is where Vincent's style is turned in a new direction. As we've looked at previously, his earlier paintings have a kind of a heaviness, a darkness. But it's in his trip to Paris that he picks up a view of painting that then just turns everything in a different direction. And this self-portrait sort of illustrates what happens to Vincent's style. It becomes very active, very, very colorful. And this is the result of his time in Paris, kind of getting exposed to the sensibilities of the Impressionists and he is not an impressionist himself, but he learns from them. And as you can see here, this quote says, "Painting as it is now promises to become more subtle, more like music and less like sculpture. And above all, it promises color." So he's trying to capture some of the dynamism of music in his depictions, and also the color that had become such a great part of the Impressionist style. This was a letter to Paul Gauguin. And you might know the name Paul Gauguin because he was kind of an artist in his own right. He was a friend of Theo. It was a part of this kind of Paris set. And Vincent's brother Theo got the idea of kind of setting Vincent up with Paul Gauguin as a roommate down in the south of France. And the thought was that they would become the nucleus of a kind of a colony of artists who would then operate in southern France, take advantage of the great light that's down there. And also, Theo was hoping that Paul Gauguin could provide his brother with some companionship. It did not work out, as we'll see in a moment. This is Paul Gauguin on the right, and that actually is Paul Gauguin's painting of Vincent on the left. And this is actually the house where they lived. And the house in Arles in southern France, which is simply called the Yellow House. I'm sad to say this was actually destroyed in World War II. It was bombed, I guess inadvertently, when the Allies invaded France. Everybody knows about the invasion of France from the north, which occurred at Normandy Beach. There was also an invasion that came up through the south. So they were, Paul Gauguin, and I mean, this is a letter, this is the text of a letter, a small portion of a text of a letter from Vincent to Paul Gauguin. And he says here, "My dear friend," he's kind of declaring his intention to achieve in painting what the music of Berlioz and Wagner has already done, an art that offers consolation for the brokenhearted. There are still just a few who feel as you and I do." So this is a great statement of Vincent's aim in his painting. You can see that even though his style has changed quite a bit, he still has a great interest in achieving through art a sympathy with those who suffer. In the beginning, of course, he was preoccupied with the poor, with the humble, with the downtrodden, with those who kind of were struggling in life. But you can see here that his interest hasn't changed, at least not entirely. Why does Vincent show such an interest in the sower? A big part of that reason is this guy. His name was Jean-Francois Millet. And he was a painter in the generation before Vincent, and Vincent was quite taken up. And you can see that Jean-Francois Millet was preoccupied with a lot of the same images and themes that captured Vincent's imagination as well. And some of these are very famous and well known. I'm sure you'll recognize most or all of these. This was a painting called The Gleaners that Millet painted. He's depicting people picking up spare bits of poor people, I guess, just picking up the leftovers from a harvest. This next one I'm sure you've seen. It's very well known. It's called The Angelus. And Millet painted this. And it's just two peasants taking a stop from their work to answer the call to the Angelus, which is probably coming from the church that one sees on the horizon. The bells have sounded, indicating it's time for the Angelus. And so they've stopped to say a few prayers, to say the Angelus itself, of course. And then here is an image of the sower. This is Millet's version of the sower. Looks very similar, we can see, to Vincent's. The sower is in the same pose. But this image, and this is another image of the sower that's painted by Millet, and Vincent makes a copy of this, almost a shot-for-shot copy in his own style. And this is one of the more than 30 renderings of the sower that Vincent puts forward for us. You can see here, like, the inspiration is very clear. And in fact, you might say that Vincent intends for us to see it. It's so unmistakable. So this is an important influence for Vincent. But I want to argue to you also, this is kind of my point, that Vincent's Christianity was tremendously important, that it was specifically his faith and the prominence of the parable of the sower in the Gospels that turned Vincent's attention in that direction. His Christian faith, and specifically the Christian faith that convinced him of the goodness of the world, the goodness of God, in spite of all of his troubles, in spite of his considerable mental troubles, and then the physical sufferings that those imposed upon him. And again, here I just have a quick little indication of these various images of the sower that Vincent puts forward for us. This is kind of a colorful but straightforward one. Here's another. This is kind of a sower, obviously on the outskirts of a town where looks like those are industrial smokestacks off in the distance. And then here we have another one, the sower at sunset. And a number of these depictions of the sower occur at sunset. And I was thinking about, why is Vincent so preoccupied with sunset? What's the big deal? And I thought, is there some sort of time? Is it like, what's going on? And it occurred to me that depicting the sower at sunset, and I think this is important, it gave Vincent the best opportunity to juxtapose the sun and the figure of the sower. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. But obviously at noon, the sun is too far overhead and it would be impossible to capture the sun in the frame. But depicting the sower at sunset allows him to feature the sun prominently in the image. I don't know that the sun is quite that bright at sunset, but that's okay. This here again is the drawing that goes along with the image that we intend to talk about. Again, carefully composed, carefully thought out. There it is again, and there's Vincent's again. Now, by emphasizing Vincent's Christianity, I'm already kind of taking a little bit of a controversial step. A big part of the interpretation of Vincent's art wants to look at his art through the lens of his mental illness. And this kind of seems maybe a little strange, but it is the case. Within the 20th century, there was even a kind of an ideology that grew up around Vincent. And he was in some sense, he is thought to have committed suicide by most people. And that death by his own hand came up to be seen almost like a kind of an artistic martyr, where he was a guy whose art was fueled by his insanity, that his wild, deranged vision of the world is what's given to us in his art, which is why actually I wanted to emphasize the way in which his art is actually very carefully considered and carefully planned. And he paid a lot of attention to artistic technique. But nevertheless, kind of an ideology emerged around Vincent that kind of saw his madness as the fuel of his artwork, and even kind of put together or created a close association between insanity or madness, as it's kind of classically called, and artistic vision. But this, I think, to kind of paraphrase from Mark Twain, may turn out to be a case of not letting the truth get in the way of a good story. And it occurred to me that maybe that's just kind of a definition of all ideology. An ideology simply being like a set of ideas that don't really have any contact with reality. And the evidence of that never seems to impede the spread of the ideology. There's good reason to doubt that Vincent did either of the two things he's most famous for. There's good reason to doubt that Vincent cut off his ear, and there's good reason to doubt even that he killed himself. And I'm going to try to demonstrate something for you here. Oops, that's the sound of my tea maker here. Ren, your tea maker is a little noisy. This is my, can I show this? Hold on a second. This is actually a mug. Oh, darn it. Wait a minute. Can you guys see this? Just nod. Okay, thumbs up. This is a mug that has Vincent van Gogh on it. And you can see his ear is safe and sound. Now, when I hold on. If the feed here cuts out, you'll know that I spilled all this hot water into my computer. I'm going to give that a moment. In the time I wait for the mug to do its thing, I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to show to you that I in my researches here on this talk, I left no stone unturned. This is a doll of not Saint Vincent, of Vincent van Gogh that I found online. It's what child would be happy to receive this? I don't know. As just an angry middle-aged man. But now the doll, as you can see, you can actually remove the ear. There it goes. Unfortunately, the Velcro sticker looks like he does have an ear, but here's his ear in my hand, having trouble holding it, and the mouse. There it goes. So that's, you can see how famous Vincent's self-mutilation is. Oh, okay, here we go. Here's the mug again. Oh, and I forgot to point out that the handle is in the shape of an ear. Can you see that? I'll put it against my black shirt so you can see it clearly. Yeah. And so here is you see the bandage has appeared? Yeah. So there you go, exhibits A and B. But this self-mutilation may simply not be the case. Vincent had descended into a very depressed state of mind. His father died in 1885, and his father, as far as Vincent was concerned, had never lived to see him succeed at anything. Vincent was unmarried. There was a tremendous frustration for him. He never had any success whatsoever with the opposite sex, as far as anybody can tell. And he never gained any financial, he was dependent on his brother Theo's help all his adult life, right up until the end. And so the fact that his father had never seen him succeed weighed on him very heavily. Vincent began drinking. He began drinking a thing called absinthe. And that's actually a painting of absinthe made by Vincent. And this is a still life in his apartment. You can see there's a mostly consumed bottle of absinthe, which tells you all you need to know. But on one night when Vincent was probably, this could be the bottle he consumed, he was deep in his cups, and Paul Gauguin had just sort of had enough. Their relationship had deteriorated. Paul Gauguin made it clear he was leaving the Yellow House where they were staying. And Paul Gauguin grabbed a few of his possessions, which happened to include a fencing sword. Paul Gauguin was an avid fencer. He was kind of a dashing man about town, as you can see in this self-portrait of him. He was a skilled fencer, and he grabbed a few items and his trusty, beloved fencing sword and left, looked over his shoulder while he was out in the street and noticed that Vincent was approaching him with a straight razor, the sort of thing you would use to shave. I've heard the old expression, never bring a knife to a gunfight. Well, Vincent brought a straight razor to a sword fight, and Paul Gauguin just hit him with it, cut off his ear. And this is actually the doctor's notes depicting the wound, just clean right off, just a quick little stroke. And all that was left was the earlobe, which is the opposite of what one often hears. One often hears that Vincent cut off his earlobe, or some portion of his earlobe, and it's actually the opposite. That a portion of the earlobe is the only thing that was left. Now, this is the book of Vincent's letters that I was reading. His letters, by the way, are fascinating. He was a very literate man. He cared a lot about ideas, cared a lot about books. And he wrote about a lot of these. This was a letter. This is from a letter that he wrote to Paul Gauguin. This is the letter more or less in its entirety. You can see that this edition represents a little doodle that Vincent put in the marginalia. It's a fish, and it has the word ictus. Now, this is a play because the word in Greek for fish is ichthus. It would be in English, it would be rendered ICHTHUS. It's where we get the word ichthyology, which is the study of fish. It's also kind of a famous Christian symbol. It doesn't have anything to do with that. This is a play because the word ictus, which sounds like ichthus, so there's a little bit of cover provided there. The word ictus is actually a fencing term. It's a term to describe a wound, or I'm sorry, it describes a thrust. It describes an attack with a sword. So this could be like Vincent's little subtle reference to Paul Gauguin. This is like a little code that they spoke to one another, because they both agreed to be silent about the attack. It's not hard to see why Vincent would want to be quiet about it. I mean, he could have been charged with assault with a deadly weapon, or maybe attempted murder or something like that. And Paul Gauguin was not exactly eager to bring a lot of attention to it either. Although there is evidence that Gauguin was kind of quietly proud of what he'd done, because it was noted that it was said that it was often said about Vincent's wound that it was done with the precision of a surgeon, and this was a source of quiet pride for Paul Gauguin that he had achieved this with his sword. This is actually an image provided by Paul Gauguin on his part. Again, it's a strange one. It's this young woman, I think, and behind her is again ictus with a picture of a fish. It's said by some people. This actually, I found this image on the Vincent van Gogh Museum website. And it was said that the fish symbolized the silence that they had agreed to observe. The fish is mute. And so they sort of agreed that they would never talk about it. And the woman is kind of gesturing in some way to her left ear. There may be some significance to that. So I'm convinced that Vincent did not cut off his own ear. And I should say that this book is where this evidence, or this is kind of reconsidered. And the authors you can see at the bottom, one of them is called Stephen Nafa, I think is how that's pronounced. And then the other one is Gregory White Smith. And they review all the evidence. And I'm convinced that they have convinced me that Vincent did not cut off his ear. There was actually Paul Gauguin. And the reason why that's important is because, again, that's one of the severing of his own ear is taken to be evidence of his total mental derangement. And it supports the view of his art that views it as fueled by his madness. And I think that, again, it's just simply not true. That vision of him just isn't as well founded as might be the case. I'm not quite as convinced, and I'll get into the indications why. I'm not quite as convinced that Vincent didn't commit suicide. These guys make a profound case. They make a very strong case that he didn't, but there are a few kind of lingering questions that remain. They think that the guy who killed Vincent, who shot him, was this fellow. And his name is René Secretan. I should have included his name. But René Secretan was a 16-year-old boy. This is him at about 83, I think. And by the way, you can see here, this is a screenshot from a YouTube video, and you can see there's a reference to 60 Minutes. This theory is reviewed in that documentary. So if you're curious about this, you could go on YouTube and just type in Van Gogh 60 Minutes, and this little documentary will come up where the authors of this book are interviewed, and they talk about their theory. And they say that this, and what they point out is that an art historian, only a few decades after Vincent's death, an art historian went to Auvers, where he died, and there the townspeople recalled for him rumors that they were confident in that Vincent had not killed himself. He was actually killed by a boy, either in an accident or on purpose. And this is the boy. The authors tracked down an interview where this guy René Secretan discussed the fact that he knew Vincent, and the authors point out he never really confesses it, but they describe it as a kind of a guilt-ridden interview. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find an English translation of it. It was given to an obscure medical journal, but these guys tracked it down and found it. This is actually a picture of René Secretan at the age of 16, drawn by Vincent. You can see he's wearing something like a cowboy hat. This guy was the only word I can think to describe him, just based on the descriptions of his behavior, this guy was just he was a punk. He loved to make fun of Vincent. Vincent was this incredibly awkward guy. René would like sneak salt into his coffee and then delight and laugh as Vincent kind of spat it out. He would put snakes into his paint box, his little brush box, And then when Vincent opened the box, he would be so startled that on some occasions, Vincent would actually pass out from fear. And this just delighted Rene to no end. One of the reasons why he's depicted in a cowboy hat is because Rene was fascinated with stories of the American West, stories of the Wild West and Custer's Last Stand and cowboys and Indians. These were kind of coming into Europe and fascinating kids at the time. And Rene had actually seen Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It had toured through France, and he went to it, and he loved it. He dressed up like a cowboy, and he even got his hands on a revolver. It was a 7mm, which is kind of a small shell, but it could do some damage if you were hit by it for sure. And in this interview, he described the gun as going off whenever it wanted to. In other words, it was a decrepit, kind of malfunctioning gun. I find that hard to believe, frankly. Guns don't, especially revolvers, don't malfunction like that. But the thought is that maybe that Rene had shot Vincent by accident, and that Vincent, just like he covered for Paul Gauguin, didn't realize he'd been fatally wounded, said that he wounded himself. Those were his words, that he wounded himself. And then when people ask what happened, he wounded himself. And then as it became clear that it was fatal, he just sort of embraced it. He'd struggled all his life. He was depressed. He lived an agonizing existence, was desperately lonely all of the time, had discussed suicide with his brother, but always ruled it out. But that was sort of his mindset. I mean, the thought is that he just saw this as a way out. This young man, for whatever reason, had opened the door for him to kind of pass from this life and just sort of be done with it. And he didn't see any reason to drag the boy down any more than he saw any reason to incriminate Paul Gauguin in that incident. There are a couple things that I find difficult about this idea. One is the author never addresses the fact that in the 1960s, a rusted revolver was found in the field where Vincent van Gogh said he shot himself. So they don't really account for that. That's seen as, no pun intended, but that's seen as a kind of a smoking gun, sort of vindicating the standard theory, which I don't think is necessarily the case. But in any case, that's something that ought to be looked at. Also, in the time it took for Vincent to die, his brother Theo joined him at his deathbed, and Vincent was still lucid. And it's hard for me to believe that Vincent wouldn't have come clean to his brother about what actually happened, and would have let his brother think that he'd killed himself when in fact he hadn't. Theo never betrays any other belief other than the fact that his brother had killed himself. So those two things stand out to me as nagging doubts. But nevertheless, the author does make a strong case. The authors of this book. But again, the two pillars then demonstrating the role of madness in Vincent's life are kind of taken away. He did certainly have, there's no denying that he had struggles, but his mental illness did not fuel his art. In fact, it seems to go the other way entirely. His mental illness impeded his art. It slowed down his production and made his life more difficult. And again, I think rather than looking to his madness, we ought to look to his Christianity, his conviction regarding the goodness of the world. And I think the parable of these images of the sower provide a demonstration of that. The fact that he was always drawn back to this image that comes out of the gospel. And that's what I want to look at now. In fact,
Father Mike.
Yes.
Somebody offered a question. I don't know if this
please.
is something you're going to cover, but
Uh-huh.
the question was, how did Vincent's mental condition affect his spiritual life, his communion with God?
Well, that's an interesting question. Why don't I come back to that at the end?
Okay.
I thought to include that in the original talk to kind of discuss some of that, because he did struggle. He struggled mightily, and some even think that he lost his faith. I don't think that's the case. In fact, the authors of this book consider that, and they don't think it's the case either. I don't know if they are themselves Christian. I don't know if they are, but they don't think he lost his faith either. In fact, why don't we just look at it? Let's just look at this is what I included, but this is what Vincent writes in a letter dated May 26, 1888. It's sad to have thoughts like this on St. Philip's Day, but that's just where he was. I feel more and more that we must not judge God from this world. It's a study that didn't come off. So he's looking at the world and his own sufferings from the perspective of an artist. A study is like, one of these things, just a preparation for the final work. I feel more and more that we must not judge God from this world. It's just a study that didn't come off. What can you do with a study that has gone wrong? If you are fond of the artist, you don't find much to criticize. You hold your tongue. But you have the right to ask for something better. We should have to see other works by the same hand, though. The world was evidently slapped together in a hurry on one of his bad days, when the artist didn't know what he was doing or didn't have his wits about him. All the same, according to what the legend says, this good old God took a terrible lot of trouble over this world study of his. I am inclined to think that the legend is right, but then the study is ruined in so many ways. It is only a master who can make such a blunder, and perhaps that is the best consolation we can have out of it, since in that case, we have a right to hope that we'll see the same creative hand get even with itself. And this life of ours, so much criticized, and for good and even exalted reasons, we must not take it for anything but what it is, and go on hoping that in some other life we will see something greater than this. Apologize for some of those typos. In its own way, I think this is kind of a beautiful statement. It's a little cynical. A cynical tone is but he suffered tremendously. Also, it has to be said, Vincent, I think, exacerbated a lot of his struggles. He struggled with lust. Let's put it that way. That was a problem he had in common with his brother Theo, who in fact died of syphilis only a year after Vincent himself died. And here's their grave, in fact. But nevertheless, there is a confidence in the goodness of God, and in the fact that, and there's a confidence taken in the fact that God will bring good, that God will finish his work. And of course, our conviction, Vincent's conviction, I think to a great extent, is that the Creator has revisited his own creation in Christ, and will bring the work to perfection. So thanks for that question. So let's look at the parable of the sower. I'll read it for you. On that day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. Kind of great that ears are mentioned in the parable, but there's more to the parable, as you can see. I'm going to skip that for now and just focus on this first part, which has to do with the kind of the career of the seed, the way it begins. It's sown, and this is sort of what I typically mention in my homily on the parable of the sower. So maybe you've heard this, but when it comes to the parable of the sower, Jesus provides a lengthy explanation for it, and that distinguishes it from most other parables. There are other parables that have more characters, more drama, parable like the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, but these do not have an explanation from Christ himself, as this one provides. And this is the explanation. And this is where Jesus says, hear then the parable of the sower. In other words, he's going to lay out his understanding, Christ's understanding. Christ provides himself an understanding of it. There are other instances when Jesus provides explanations for his parables, But I think all of those have to do with the sowing of seeds. And I think that alone kind of underscores the importance of the parable. And maybe it shows why Vincent's attention was drawn to it. But I think what also ought to be considered is the fact that Christ focuses on seeds and the planting of seeds precisely because it gets to how God operates. God himself is a seed planter. And Christ makes that clear in the Gospels, as we've already noted. But then also, if we think about even scientific theories, the Big Bang posits that the universe was an infinitely dense point that then, like a seed, all that we see around us was contained in the singularity that then began expanding rapidly and developing like a plant developing from a seed. Even like sort of say the theory of evolution, in as much as that's to be believed, life began from the smallest rudiments of life, but now all the complexity and wonder of the biological world around us emerge from those smallest points. Even an individual, seeds are still an essential part of reproduction of all kinds. Also, within the realm of faith, God operates as a seed planter. God gives faith to Abraham, and now his descendants, in fulfillment of the prophecy, are as many as the sand of the seashore, the dust of the earth, and the stars of the heavens, encircling the sons of Abraham, the daughters of Abraham, encircle the globe now. But it all began from that one man, as though planted in his heart like a seed that then has spread. Christ himself, the church begins from just 12 disciples, and even among those, 3 had a special intimacy with Christ, Peter, James, and John. So the church itself grows as though from a seed. And so I think that it remains a powerful metaphor in those ways, but also it describes the career of Christ himself. Christ himself is a seed that's planted into history, that's sown into history by the Father. He's the Word who's then given to the created world. You can see in the parable that the negative comes first. The birds attack the seed first. Then there's rocky ground where things get off to a good start, but then the roots can't gain a purchase in the soil. And then it's choked by weeds, and then the good soil comes. In the life of Christ, it goes the opposite way. Christ first comes to the Holy Family. They're the good soil. They welcome and allow Christ to take root. But then Christ encounters, say, King Herod, and he would be like one of the birds of the sky that attacks the word. Herod attacks Christ in the infancy stories in order to drive him out of history. Then Christ meets his apostles, his own disciples, who are like this seed that gets off to a good start, but then can't follow through. They get excited about Jesus' message, they follow him, but then on Good Friday, their faith just isn't deep enough, not strong enough, and they fall away. And then, of course, like Pontius Pilate and King Herod could be thought of as the thorns that grow up and choke Christ. Again, trying to drive him out. They seem to succeed, but of course, there's more to the story than just that. I think also the parable of the sower forms a great metaphor for the fate of Christ's seed in us as individuals. There's a good soil within us that welcomes and rejoices to hear the gospel. We're attracted to the gospel in some way. But then there's also a portion of us that maybe that makes plans for our discipleship. We like the idea of overcoming faults, building up virtues, developing good habits, but then we lack the strength, we lack the courage to follow through. So we're like the seed that falls on the rocky soil that sprouts but can't quite put down roots. And we're also like maybe there's a portion of us that actually resists the activity of Christ within us, that we are like the birds of the air or these thorns, that we drive away Christ in ways maybe that we don't perceive. So I think that the parable is powerful and relevant and demonstrates its value, even though it isn't as exciting or as interesting. It's not as literarily complex as some of the other parables that Christ tells, but it's important, in other ways. And again, it was one that Vincent returned to consistently. These are the ones that we've looked at before. Let's see. But one of the other aspects of the parable that I think we ought to look at, and again, the painting kind of draws our attention to it, is the relentlessness with which the work of spreading seed is undertaken. In the as far as the painting is concerned, the time is frozen. The painting captures a moment and then freezes that moment and makes it, in human terms at least, eternal. That sun has been shining and that guy has been throwing seed ever since Vincent painted him. And I think that captures the relentlessness of this distribution of the seed. But also, what I think a fascinating portion of the parable that we can look back on is that Christ braces us. He calls us to be sowers. He calls us to have confidence in the fact that God is a sower, but he calls us to be sowers as well. And I think that in that call, he braces us frankly, he braces us for a lot of failure, or at least what seems to be failure. Most of this seed comes to nothing. Most of this seed is either falls on rocky ground or is eaten by a bird or is choked by a weed. Only a small percentage of it actually falls on good soil. And that, I think, is captured beautifully by the painting, especially perhaps the sun. And the sun is, as I've said, the sun is an important image in some of these other depictions of the sower. And in fact, in other paintings of Vincent as well. This is a beautiful painting of a sun over a wheat field. And if you look closely there, you can see a harvester. He's at work in the field. This is an olive grove. And again, the sun is larger than life, literally. And again, even in that, in saying it's larger than life, that gets to one of Vincent's methods. I mean, I've already talked to you about the fact that Vincent's madness, or his alleged madness, plays too great a role in understanding his work, his life. It contradicts also what Vincent said about himself. I don't know, did I put that in here? I may have forgotten to put it, but Jesus, darn it. No, yeah, I guess I forgot to include it. Here it is. In a letter to Theo, his brother, in 1888. Well, I'm sorry, he doesn't quite say this. I came across on the website of the Van Gogh Museum in the Netherlands, it was an article in the Wall Street Journal on Vincent van Gogh. That's where I got this from. But an art historian said that Vincent said at one point that he presents a reality that is more than real. I tried to find that quote and I couldn't. This is the closest thing I could find to it in his letters. This is Vincent talking to Theo about an author named Bunyan. I assume that must be John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress. But he mentioned it in the context of a number of other books that Pilgrim's Progress didn't seem to fit into. But in any case, it said, and in Bunyan, there is something more real than reality itself, something hitherto unknown. If only you can read it, will tell you untold things. And I think that probably the art historian read that quote and then realized that that's what Vincent did in a lot of his paintings. He departed from verisimilitude in order to emphasize certain aspects of reality that maybe we don't typically notice. Many artists do this. The first time I came across this idea, it was in conjunction with literature, or I think it was actually Flannery O'Connor, where I first came across the idea that she exaggerated. All her stories contain portraits of these like deranged people, but she said she exaggerated spiritual illnesses to a grotesque extent so that we could recognize them better in us where they dwell in less exaggerated ways. So you emphasize a feature of reality, make it outsized and even like a little grotesque, so that we can recognize, so we can see it in reality a little more clearly. And that's what Vincent was up to. That's why he's depicting the sun in this exaggerated way. But the sun is, the sun is relentless, and it doesn't bother the sun that most of the sun's light is going out into the blackness of space. I mean, that's kind of the amazing thing about the sun. It's radiating energy in all directions, but only a tiny fraction of that energy hits the earth where it fuels any light. So the same as Christ tells us is true of the sower. Christ explains to us that most of the seed that's being cast by the sower is going to come to nothing. But again, he just doesn't neither let that stop them. And we can see too that the sower then forms a kind of a counterpart to the sun, that the sun and the sower are both relentless in their distribution of goodness. Or we might say further, that the sun in the sower creates a likeness of himself. The sun distributes his goodness in good times and in bad. He distributes his goodness, whether it's out into the blackness of space, out into, or even just the tiny bit that actually hits the earth and fuels life. And the sun doesn't count the cost. The sun is just true to itself in its work as a star, and it's radiating light and energy that again fuels this little bit of life. The sower, for his part, he participates in this work of the sun and facilitates it. He cultivates the life that the sun makes possible and becomes a kind of a microcosm or a kind of a miniature version of the sun, sowing his goodness faithfully in imitation of the sun from which he receives that goodness. So the sower becomes a counterpart of the sun. And again, this is why I think the sun is so strongly emphasized in Vincent's paintings. This is a drawing I found. It's a depiction of a sun kind of radiating its light over what looks like a field of sunflowers. And there again, you get this idea of the sunflower. The sunflower kind of looks like a sun. And that's the goal. I mean, the parable of the sower says God sows his goodness into the world in order to create new sowers, those who will receive that goodness and indicate the fact that they have received that goodness by themselves becoming sowers, by taking up the work of the sower and amplifying and magnifying his distribution of his own goodness. And here again, as far as I can tell, this painting was never achieved. I tried to find the canvas that obviously Vincent was planning to paint when he drew this, and I didn't find anything. Perhaps some of you have seen something like that. But there's also another idea. Oh, this is a bit of a typo here. Let me correct that. There's an old idea, although it's I think it comes from a philosopher that's after Christ. But what I was just describing to you is kind of described philosophically. And please be patient with me as I try to unfold this philosophical idea. But I think it does describe what Vincent is depicting. And Vincent, maybe with an artist's intuition and his own interior convictions, was gravitating towards this depiction of reality, which is described by this idea, which is described by this definition, bonum est diffusivum sui. And that's Latin. And it says goodness is diffusive of itself. It's of the very nature of goodness to distribute itself. Goodness shares itself. And in sharing itself, by sharing itself, goodness draws everything to itself. So it's kind of a double movement within goodness. Goodness shares itself, it sends itself out, and having sent itself out, it then attracts people to itself. And it's a beautiful idea. It's similar to the idea of the sower. I mean, you even get that idea of like casting out, but the idea of bonum est diffusivum sui says that that outward movement then generates a return. And you can see how it resonates deeply with the Christian idea of creation, where God distributes his goodness in the act of creation. But then in our experience of the goodness of all that God has made, we are attracted to God, and we want to turn to God to praise him for his good works, to praise him for his great deeds. And but then also take up the work of then spreading that goodness, of magnifying, proclaiming, and spreading the goodness that we have received. And that's a sign, again, our willingness to spread the goodness of God will be a sign that we have received it worthily. This actually comes up, this idea of bonum est diffusivum sui. It came up recently in a Sunday. You might remember a few weeks ago, there was a gospel passage where a guy is forgiven an enormous debt. But then when he goes out, he refuses to forgive a guy who owed him, in fact, far less, like an infinitesimal amount. And then the master finds out about it and punishes the guy. And the crime of the guy is in not really receiving the master's generosity. Had he received that generosity fully, he would be eager to display it and to share. Having been forgiven, having received mercy, he should then be disposed to want to display it. And by undertaking the work of mercy, of being generous with forgiveness, of being generous with praise of God, we prepare ourselves to receive yet more from God. We sort of enter into this economy of exchange. God gives us his mercy, we share it, and we receive more, so we have more to give. And again, I think that it's an idea that's kind of, again, this philosophical description of the good. And somebody pointed out, there was a philosopher named Adams, and he wrote a book about virtue, and he was presenting a kind of a Platonic, that is to say, rather than an Aristotelian theory of virtue, which is more typical, he was presenting a Platonic view of virtue. And he made the point that Platonic philosophies emphasize the good, the philosophical idea of the good. And there's a lot that could be said about that, but good is one of the transcendentals. Goodness, being, and truth. Is that right? Truth, being, and goodness? Truth, beauty, and goodness. They are the transcendental qualities of being. And what's referred to there is the fact that everything has some kind of goodness. Everything that exists, everything that has being contains or is good. But no one thing contains goodness itself. No one thing exhausts. It's a quality that everything shares in. So the quality of goodness transcends any one good thing. That's what's meant by transcendent. And so that's, but these Platonic philosophies tend, as this guy Adams pointed out, these Platonic philosophies, precisely because they are close to the notion of the good, they tend to have a religious dimension. They tend to say, because goodness, I mean, being and truth are great, of course, but goodness is specifically that quality of reality that gives us delight. You could say that an ice cream cone is true, and you can say that it is, but it's the goodness of an ice cream cone that keeps bringing us back. And that's kind of the quality of reality that's kind of captured by the good. And it's something that we're inclined to praise, that we're inclined to celebrate. And that's why religion and worship tends to characterize these Platonic, even though they're not Christian, not necessarily. Plato is not a Christian, and there are lots of philosophical traditions that he inspired that can be described as Platonic, but aren't necessarily Christian. So this is, but there's actually an image where I think Vincent captures this in a way that I just find kind of compelling, and it's this one. It's pollarded willows and setting sun. So again, it's at sunset, precisely because you can put the sun on the horizon. And these are pollarded trees. This is the first time I ever saw a pollarded tree where I thought, okay, maybe that's beautiful. Because I was in Europe in the late 90s, and the pollarding of trees is more common there. It's when you cut off all the branches. I remember seeing these in the Czech Republic, and of course the Czech Republic is a kind of an Eastern Bloc kind of a place, so it can already be kind of gloomy. And these trees just sort of like underscored the feeling of desolation in a lot of places. This is just the saddest sight, of a city landscape one could see, except for some sort of human problem. But this is what a pollarded tree looks like up close. The idea is that you would pollard a tree for two reasons. One is, as the tree gets too large, it's a way to make sure it doesn't outgrow the space that's been allotted for it. The other is that the branches grow out in great profusion, as you can see here. Actually, no, that's not the case. So here, and so it's a way that farmers will do this to increase the yield of the tree. If a tree grows berries, obviously there are a lot more branches on a pollarded tree to produce berries than would otherwise be the case. And by the way, this I found this article online to kind of confirm my opinion of pollarded trees. I found this picture in an article that was about a town in London where the people were complaining that they woke up one morning to discover their trees had been pollarded by the city officials, and nobody was happy about it. But you can see here that Vincent takes another look at it. And this image of these pollarded trees kind of becomes this magnificent image of the earth's rays pouring out from the heavens, and then the limbs, and even you can see the grass, this kind of vegetation along the ground is kind of answering that gift. The light is pouring down and up. It's going out in all directions. And the earth, and you see in this growth of vegetation and in the limbs of these pollarded trees, you see a kind of an answer to that gift, to that generosity. And of course, Vincent transfigures this image. What would otherwise be a bleak, what I saw with my very sort of standard vision of things, I just saw a mess. But Vincent, of course, was able to see something quite else, and to transfigure and to kind of help us perhaps see the beauty of it. Again, a world that he knew, he was convinced of the world's goodness, but of course, even in his own life, as we read earlier, he was convinced of its brokenness as well. But he devoted his artistic career to helping people see the beauty where they might otherwise miss it. And I think he does that magnificently in this image of the sower. You see too, the sower kind of, in the way that Vincent chooses to depict the sower, he's kind of at the threshold of heaven and earth. His head is above the horizon, kind of sharing the space of the sun, but then his feet are on the ground here, and he's engaging in the work of spreading these seeds. And I just think it's a magnificent painting, as I think so many of his paintings are magnificent. So, okay, well, that's all I have. But we still have about 15 minutes. Emily, are there any questions?
Not as of yet.
Okay.
But if anyone has questions, if they want to raise their hand within Zoom, there was one portion of a question. I think you addressed some part of it about how Vincent saw the sower, but is it possible he saw himself as a sower, a seed scatterer of beauty?
That's kind of interesting. Let me, I'm going to stop my share for a moment, and then I'm going to resume it. Or I should say, Emily, is there a way for me to get out of this like limited screen share business?
I think if you just use the share screen down at the bottom again.
Okay.
I think you might be able to exit. There you go.
And now can you see me?
Yes.
And can you see my screen at all?
No.
Okay. Let me try to. Okay, there we are. Yeah, good. Hello, everybody. This is me. And so
Now we are seeing your screen again.
yeah, but you see me too, right? Do you see me as well?
Yes.
Okay. Did he think, I don't remember any explicit statement on Vincent's part indicating that he was in some sense, a sower of seed. I mean, his artistic vision is he certainly has a sense of mission. And we heard that a little bit in his statement to Paul Gauguin, that he thought of art as meant to provide happiness to the brokenhearted. So there is a distribution of goodness that he thinks art as providing. So in as much as that's the case, I'd be inclined to say yes to that. There is a magnificent letter, by the way, written by John Paul II. He wrote a letter to artists. That's available online. It's on the Vatican website. It's really excellent. Just sort of showing how artists are meant to help us see the goodness of the world. And of course, Christian art has a special role to play in that. And he also, of course, Christian art includes depictions of Christ, which are meant to kind of make us more sympathetic with the poor and the downtrodden, with those who suffer. And so the Christian artist, I think, has a special, and I do think that to a great extent, Vincent van Gogh conforms himself to the vision of a Christian artist that John Paul II describes there. In his moral life, he was pretty confused, and there's no question about it. I don't mean to argue that he was a saint. I think I did at one point accidentally call him Saint Vincent, but that was inadvertent. He was a troubled man, but he, as I say, I think he nearly lost his faith. I mean, people think he did lose his faith. Again, I don't think that's true. But that may be, maybe one of the reasons why he didn't lose his faith was because he was too broken and weak to resist the urge to disbelieve in God. Or he was too broken to resist. He was too broken and weak to resist his own conviction. That's a strange way to describe it, but in my thought of, as I was thinking about him, as I was reading about his life and work, I couldn't help but sort of think along those lines that he just couldn't put up a resistance against this kind of nagging conviction that the world, in spite of all that he'd suffered, this nagging conviction that the world is in fact good. His last words were very sad. His last words that his brother heard, his brother was at his deathbed when he died, but before he slipped into his final state of unconsciousness, Theo said he heard Vincent say something like, "The sadness will be forever." And that's it's an awful thought. So he was a troubled man. There's no question about it. But his paintings, I think, speak to a deeper conviction.
Father Mike, there's a question in the chat. Any idea why the use of blue for the ground of the sower?
Huh. I don't know. It's funny you say that, because I do find, as impressive as this painting is, I find the color scheme a little monotonous. There's a lot of blue. The blue of the ground, the blue of the sower. I mean, you compare it to a painting like this, I just think this is a spectacular image. And so many of the other paintings have a similar, just a lot of different colors. That particular image of the sower, for all its beauty, is kind of it's just I don't know. I do find it a little monotonous, but I the short answer is I don't know. I don't know if the blue has any special connection.
If there are any other questions, y'all should be able to unmute yourself now. So if anyone wants to jump in with a question, feel free.
Well, I have lots of questions, too many actually, but a simple one is why the same attitude in the sower? Because sowing involves a lot of different gestures, taking the seed out of the bag and throwing, casting. So why is always in the same attitude, like a spring about to, you know what I mean?
Well, I think when his arm is extended, it's a gesture of casting. It's it emphasizes kind of the act of distribution. There are I think there is at least one image that I include where he's not doing that. Let's see here. Oh no, okay. He is. I thought maybe in this one his hand was in the bag, but it's not the case. Yeah, I think it's because of the connection between sowing and distribution. So you can see here, this is Malay's version. You can even see here that the seed are visible. Just captures the gesture of spreading, I think. Again, forming a counterpart to the sun, where the sun is seen, these kind of very dramatic rays indicate the sun's radiation of goodness.
There's a comment in the chat, Father Mike, that someone thinks they read somewhere that he might have been colorblind. Not sure if you came across that in any of your research.
I did not come across that. I'm inclined to doubt it, but that it could be the case. I mean, he was a master of color, and that was self-conscious. He studied color assiduously, and he really sought to. And it's hard to imagine a person doing that if you were colorblind.
It looks like maybe what Eric shared a link in here. It looks like maybe it is saying that he was colorblind.
Yeah, at least some people think that he was, and they took his paintings and they put them through a color filter to map them to what would be the colors that a non-colorblind person would see, and then it brings out interesting features of the painting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Do you suppose that his repeated painting of the sower was his attempt to spiritually rally?
It could be. I had a similar thought that he was, trying to inspire others, but also trying to inspire himself. Yeah, I take that very seriously. I think that's very definitely a possibility. I had the same thought as that he was just, that he was returning to a kind of it was an expression of a hope or an aspiration, a desire to see the world in this way. But to rally is a good way of describing it, perhaps.
Question, Father Michael, what ultimately compels you about Van Gogh's art?
Well, I find it beautiful, just straightforwardly. I find it's colorful and rich. I do think he accomplishes the goal of helping people see things they might otherwise miss. I mean, I sort of brought that out a little bit in my description of my own experience of pollarded trees, just how awful they look. But in this painting, I think this is one of his most magnificent paintings. And he really did change the way that I look at pollarded trees, for what it's worth. We don't see them too often in the United States. They're more common in Europe. But I do, and I think too, there's a real sympathy, even that idea of him trying to rally himself in his faith, of trying to kind of shore up his own confidence in the world's good, to reassure himself in his work. I find that very sympathetic, and to sort of say that, to think that for all his own personal anguish, his trouble, his last word is his art, which is very evidently a celebration of the goodness and the beauty of creation. That perhaps that's what I prefer to, you know, his last words indicate a soul that's deeply frustrated, a soul that is close to despair. But I prefer to think of it, perhaps I do prefer to think of his art as his truest last word.
Did he write much regarding his faith life?
Not a tremendous amount. I mean, there are indications in his letters. I mean, I quoted some of them, that he and Theo both were believers, and they shared thoughts about the faith. They shared thoughts about everything. I mean, the correspondence is really interesting to read. But he didn't write any extended treatise on religion or faith. Again, I think his paintings are the place to look.
Somebody sort of offered a comment here, maybe trying to figure out which seed he was and where he landed.
Yeah. And maybe troubled at the prospect that he was one of the seeds that hadn't come off, that hadn't sprouted and borne fruit. He only sold one canvas in the course of his life. He only sold one painting. I think he just regarded himself as a failure. Actually, as far as that is concerned, I did include here, I knew I was running out of time, but I skipped over this little passage from Cardinal Newman. When in contemplating, the idea that we have to be prepared to deal with what seems like, in the doing of good, we have to be prepared to experience what's going to seem like futility, what's going to seem like fruitlessness. And the parable of the sower braces for that and encourages us to keep at it. And again, I sort of identified that as a quality of Vincent's painting. But in this meditation by Cardinal Newman, we find the same exact thing articulated for us. And you're probably familiar with it, but I'll read it for you. God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me, which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. I'm a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be an angel of peace, a preacher of truth in my own place, while not intending it, if I but keep his commandments. Therefore, I will trust in him. Whatever I am, I can never be thrown away. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. He does nothing in vain. He knows what he is about. He may take away my friends. He may throw me among strangers. He may make me feel desolate, make my spirit sink, hide my future from me. Still, he knows what he is about. It's a powerful meditation, but I think it's precisely oriented towards that feature of the parable of the sower, where, again, it has to do with human perception. And I think Cardinal Newman is addressing those instances where we perceive pointlessness. And for St. John Henry Newman is simply saying, our faith has to tell us that nothing is pointless. Our fidelity, no matter how pointless it may seem, is serving God's purpose. And of course, for Vincent, he went to his death perhaps thinking he was a failure, but of course now he's considered one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest modern artist. So all the more reason, I suppose, to just to be faithful, to try to do good, to not be discouraged by whatever failures arise, and to persevere in the work of being a Christian disciple.
So someone on YouTube commented that blue is a simple representation of water or a cleansing of the ground, but there's also an explanation here. I'm going to botch this name up. Xanthopsia, something like that, is the name of the condition where one sees yellow where whites and yellows would be indistinguishable, and to the painter, blues would appear as green.
Blues would appear as green.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting, but of course, in other instances, Vincent is able to depict green accurately. So even if he were colorblind, that wouldn't necessarily explain the blue. Also, his clothing is blue. The house is blue. I don't know. Maybe he had a surplus of blue paint and he had a lot of blue paint he was trying to get rid of. I don't know. I'm sorry, Laura. It sounded like Laura.
He's got that blue line in the painting that you like of the trees. Yeah, he's got that blue along the horizon, or I don't know. I was thinking, is that water? Is that, and even the trees are blue. So it's kind of an interesting use of blue.
The trees have a kind of a bluish gray.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, trying to think of another.
It's intentional. It doesn't look like it was supposed to, like he thought it was green, you know?
Right. I think so too. But we may never know for sure. Mm. He does depict, he gets the green of this absinthe bottle correct. There's a lot of blue here too. It's a kind of a different shade. I'm not inclined to make much of it. He definitely plays with a lot of weird color schemes, but he's a good enough artist to get away with it. You know, it's he gets Mary's mantle blue right. His vision of Malay is all blue as well. Yeah, I don't know.
Blue would not be cheap pigment in those times.
It would not be a what?
It would not be it would be more costly pigment than some other, like an earth tone or a ochre or something during those times.
Interesting.
And during those times also, there were chromate pigments that were, I hate to muddy everything, but there were chromate pigments that were introduced, and they were used by impressionists, and some of those pigments actually were fugitive. They didn't stay yellow. They were the first spectrum yellow pigments, and they did not stay yellow. They went to either greens or browns or like army green colors.
Interesting.
Something like that. So that may be something that in this picture in particular, maybe there were some things that were more yellow originally that became a brown color in the earth and in the where he's sowing.
Mm-hmm.
Another comment I have is on the pruning, the pollarding.
Yeah.
Pruning is something I don't recall like where, if anywhere in the Gospels they mention pruning. But
well, the vine and the branches.
Oh yeah, that's right. And that is the most efficient way of using the sun. So if you want to use the sun, the most efficient way is to smartly prune your tree or your vine or your branch or what have you.
Okay.
And then one last comment. One of the things they found with Van Gogh is that he had hypergraphia, which just means he liked to make a lot of marks. So you saw that in the time period that he created like hundreds of paintings and drawings and etudes, studies. And that's just a symptom of mental illness.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. You see, one of the techniques that he picked up in France was similar to what you're describing, but it certainly wasn't. It was a technique that's well known and described. Let me see. I might have one here. In this auto portrait, you see he's got all these little marks all around.
Yes.
But you can see that he is capable of not doing that. I mean, in some of these other images, they're more conventional. And certainly here, there's none of that. But one of the things I don't know the technique. It's related to, see, there was actually an artistic movement that was like never really got a whole lot of traction. It was called pointillism.
Oh yeah,
It was mastered by a guy named Seurat.
Yeah.
This guy named Seurat mastered it. And there's a couple famous pictures where there's the picture consists entirely of tiny little dots. And it must have taken, I don't know how the guy did it. It must have taken forever to compose these paintings.
There's a Seurat in the Carnegie Museum of Art.
Okay, very good. But the thing is, with what Van Gogh discovered, like everybody know that yellow and green, how does it go? Yellow and blue make green, right? Isn't that's how it works? Yeah. So yellow and blue make green. So what you can do is you can mix those paints together to create green. That's the straightforward way to do it. But if in your painting you put a blue dot next to a yellow dot, it creates the effect of green in your eye. It's like an optical illusion. But you also get this interesting dynamism between the two dots. So it's a way of getting the color you want, but also creating a more lively visual experience. So maybe Vincent van Gogh had all kinds of mental problems, but maybe that was one of them. But that was certainly, there are images, I don't have any in my presentation, but there are images where he does this, where he just puts dots of two different colors side by side. Actually, here's kind of one of them. Yeah. The portrait that's on the front of this book cover is one. But I mean, again, like there's a lot of talk about his mental illness, and I think it's or like his physiological deficiencies. I think that's just not the way to understand his art. I just think he's up to something else. He struggled with all kinds of problems. I don't deny that. But I don't think that his achievement can be understood in terms of anything other than an artistic genius that he cultivated over the course of a short but very intense life. We're a little bit over time. We're gonna close, I guess. So thanks a lot for joining. I hope this was of value. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, and I just hope it was. I hope it was good. So let's close.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah, you're most welcome. So let's close with a prayer, and then I guess we'll say good night. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go forth. The Zoom is ended. No, the Zoom goes on forever. It was a pleasure, everybody. Thanks again.